for this special meeting of the Town Council of Los Gatos of August 11th, 2022. And let's start with a roll call.
Councilmember Sack. Here. Councilmember Hudis.
Here.
Councilmember Badami.
Here.
Vice Mayor Risto.
Here.
Mayor Rennie.
Here. Thank you. Could we roll our meeting decorum video, please?
The public is welcome to participate at Town Council meetings, understanding that the purpose of the meetings is to conduct the important business of the town in an efficient and effective manner. At each meeting, the following expectations of civil conduct shall apply. 1. For the benefit of the entire community, the Town of Los Gatos asks that all speakers follow the town's meeting guidelines by treating everyone with respect and dignity. This is done by following meeting guidelines set forth in state law, in the town code, and on the cover sheet of the council agenda. 2. The town embraces diversity and strongly condemns hate speech and offensive hateful language or racial intolerance of any kind at council meetings. 3. Town council and staff are well aware of the public's right to disagree with their professional opinion on various town issues. However, antisocial behavior, slander, hatred, and bigotry statements are completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated in any way, shape, or form at Town Council meetings. 4. All public comments at the Town Council meeting must pertain to items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the town and shall not contain slanderous statements, hatred, and bigotry against non-public officials. 5. The town will go through the following steps if a disturbance results from a member of the public not following these rules. If participating remotely, town staff may mute the individual with an explanation for the record of why muting occurred consistent with this policy. If participating in person, the mayor may call a recess for violation of this policy, resulting in the immediate cessation of the audio and video recording and the council exiting the chamber. Staff will determine if the individual should be removed or if all members of the public should leave, depending on the extent of the disturbance. In the event that all public members exit, only the press would be allowed back in the meeting. Once the individual or individuals leave, the council would return to the chamber and the mayor would resume the meeting. Persons disrupting a council meeting may be cited for violation of the California Penal Code Section 403. These expectations of conduct also apply to meetings of all town boards, committees, and commissions.
All right, great. Thank you. Since tonight is a special meeting of the Town Council, we will only be having public comment on items that are on the agenda. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to follow up from our last meeting with wording for the ballot measure that we have interest of putting on the ballot in November, and tomorrow is the deadline, so today needed to be a meeting to do that. Since we were already meeting and I thought it was kind of relevant, I added to the agenda, or asked the town manager to add to the agenda, the 5-year forecast that the Planning Commission, Finance Commission had just looked at. So that's the first item on our agenda, and I will turn that item over to staff.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Town Council. So as you just mentioned, this item was brought before the Finance Commission, and this item is intended to serve one function, and that's to show the updates relative to the labor actions that were taken on the June 21st council meeting. And so this is really a partial update, just reflecting those labor changes. As you can see, with the labor outcome, it has increased our deficits, but I do want to say the town continues to follow kind of its normal budget cycle, mid-year budget cycle, and the development of the actual 5-year forecast, which typically will come before council in February. So I don't want it to appear as if this was presented in isolation with no other plan for how we're going to address the deficits. At the Finance Commission, they had their first meeting to start discussions on the council direction to spend the course of the next year looking at ways to address, well, first to identify what the extent of any deficits might be, but then to also look at both expenditure and revenue ways to address those deficits and to do it in a fashion that aligns with the budget process so they can bring recommendations to this council late winter, early spring to align with the budget process. And so there was also a desk item issued, which just shows some of the financial management that has taken place, as we've addressed budgets year after year. And with that, staff is available for any questions or comments.
All right, do we have any questions before I open up to public comment? Not seeing any hands, I will go to public comment. Would any members of the public wish to comment on this item? Don't see any hands raised, so I'll come back to council for questions and comments. Councilmember Hudes.
Thank you. I wasn't able to attend the Finance Commission, but I did listen to the recording of it earlier today, and it seemed like the ball got rolling on dealing with this structural deficit, and it's great to have their help with it. I had a couple of specific questions about the 5-year forecast, and I wondered if be okay if I asked a couple of questions about the numbers.
Yes, please go ahead.
So looking at the let's see, what page is this on? Page three of the report. It looks like there's I'm just focusing on some of the significant differences, and it looks like there's a drop of about $800,000 in the town services line. There's also an increase of about 1.2 million in the other sources line. I wondered if those were related and why the proposed drop of 800,000 and the increase of 1.2 million.
And I'll defer those questions to Interim Finance Director Angmari.
Yes. Thank you for the question. So what I have to honestly, we updated the salary schedule on this and the salary number, and just have to go and just to my memory on the town services. One of the way the town services were higher because we were conducting the general plan earlier, and the general plan is just right now it's finished, and so we are using less of that money, so we can see the town services some revenue drop because we are pulling that money in from the general fund reimbursement. And for the other sources, I have to research that number for you. I don't know by heart right now to tell the difference. But
Okay, thank you.
I can do that. Thank you.
And if I may, there's one other significant number, and that's the intergovernmental between the 21-22 adopted budget and the 21-22 estimate of 4.0 million versus 1.1 million.
So it's the intergovernmental revenue was budgeted ARPA proceeds, and it might be the difference of that, how we are handling it accounting wise.
Okay, so that you think that's ARPA proceeds that were in the budget, but were not part of the estimate. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Those are the only questions I had. I think a lot of the other questions were raised by the Finance Commission, and this is an information only item, correct?
It is.
So I just wanted to just comment then that this structural budget deficit is serious. It looks, without applying some of the updates that were actually apparent in the key performance indicator part of the report, it looks like the budget deficit went from about 2 million to almost 4 million on an annual basis, which is, a very serious concern. And I think that from what I heard from the Finance Commission and from looking at the numbers myself, we're going to need to address both the revenue side as well as the cost side. And the questions that I would ask would be, how much can we generate in either one of those? How soon can we generate it, and how sure can we be that those funds would come in? So it's not just picking one number for an item, but it's also evaluating some of the qualitative aspects of the ideas that are going to get generated. So I look forward to further conversations with the Finance Commission and the Council on this topic, but as you can see, we're going to need to deal with a very substantial amount of money.
Okay, any other questions? I would ask the question, and I asked it last night, I'll ask it again. The proposed or forecasted budget deficit, we know includes cost savings each year from, for example, most of it is now from salary savings for positions that are still open. So really what people are trying to understand, what is the real deficit over a 5-year time frame, for example. It seems to me, in my mind, I've integrated, there's usually about $2 million of savings every year. So if I said it over 5 years, how much are we going to be in the hole? This looks like 20 million. But if we're really saving the same 2 million every year, it's now 10 million in the hole over 5 years. Can staff comment on that a little bit? And what do we think the real budget deficit is on an ongoing basis? I understand from a budgeting, but then at the end of the year, we always make up some of that deficit. But when we add up over a long period of time, what is our real structural deficit?
And thank you, Mayor. And similar to the conversation at the Finance Commission, one of the things we're going to do is to try and refine what we do think the structural deficit is. But to your point, even with the more conservative measures we've taken over the last several years based on guidance from the Finance Commission and from yourselves, we still end up having typically some salary savings every year. It used to be greater. As I mentioned, we've taken a more conservative approach to budgeting, and so it's less. But we also just had an unusual year, when you think of it in terms of the Great Resignation. We've had significant vacancies, and so there will be savings. I don't know if that's something we can extrapolate into the future. Hopefully not. Hopefully we don't have the types of vacancies that we had the past year. But even with more conservative budgeting practices, there typically is going to be salary savings, and that's an item that the Finance Commission wanted us to do a time series analysis on, kind of look at it over the course of the last 5 years to try and get an estimate like you're trying to get to with what we think potentially would be a salary savings factor going forward. And so that is an area that isn't encompassed in a 5-year forecast. That's why we refer to it as a forecast. It's not an adopted budget, and it's also not an annual comprehensive financial report. So it's intended to help guide us. And clearly, these numbers, everybody rightfully so, is concerned, because we do need to make sure that we have the ability to balance budgets year after year. And so the Finance Commission is going to be looking at that as part of their analysis.
Okay, second question related to this. Thank you for the desk item. There was a long list of all the things the council's been doing over the last 5 or 6 years to keep our head above water, but we seem to have cement shoes on that keep trying to pull us down. The question really is, now going forward, we've done so much in the past. How can we find things in the future to keep our head above water? And what plan or process does staff have to help us figure out how to close that gap?
Thank you for the question. So as you mentioned, the desk item shows kind of an incremental approach, which has been the plan. You know, when we discussed the next item last Tuesday, we talked about not trying to overly impact one constituent or constituency through revenue measures. And so you can see that's been our approach, whether it was originally a modest increase in TOT in 2016, a 1/8 district tax in 2018, annexations, which really all it did was change a diversion of revenue that should have been staying in the town to the county. So we will continue to try and come up with ideas. The next item you discussed is an idea that we started floating about a year ago, and now it appears as if it's coming to fruition, and it would be another incremental step. That being said, you know, staff has said that in 2024, it might be time, you know, to also look to our residents to participate, you know, in the services that we provide. To date, we've done visitors, we've done hotel visitors, we've done, you know, folks that shop in town. If the council moves forward on the next item, that would have the businesses contribute a little more. And so in 2024, one of the remaining tools would be to see if the residents are willing to participate also. On the expense side, at the Finance Commission, management committed to that commission that we will put together packages of what expenditure reductions could look like and what the impacts to the organization or service delivery could be. But we do want to put together some of those options so that they know what the trade-offs are of looking at expenditures versus revenues and where they think they can find a reasonable balance to present to council, depending on what the magnitude of the deficits are, you know, 6 months from now. Because as I mentioned, this is just a partial forecast. We have not updated revenues yet. We continue to be hopeful on revenues. So we think there's going to be some incremental improvement there. Come around the December timeframe, you'll recall that we closed the books on last year. We're hopeful that there could be some incremental small surpluses there to carry over. So all of this combined, you know, will give us a better picture of the magnitude we're looking for 23-24. And then obviously that will then ripple throughout the rest of the forecast. So over the course of the next 6 months, we're going to get a lot more information. The Finance Commission will ultimately bring recommendations to this council to align with your budget process. And as I mentioned, you know, it's a forecast. We currently have a balanced budget for 22-23. We'll close the books on 21-22, and then we'll see where we think we're heading in the rest of the forecast.
And Mayor, if I may, I just want to reinforce that the staff is as concerned as all of you are about the forecast. So I'm already working with the directors on our next fiscal year budget, 23-24. It's important that we continue to look at efficiencies with a lot of new directors. It provides an opportunity to do an organizational assessment and look at cost structures. And so we are now initiating that work. And so as we are working with the Finance Commission, we'll also be working internally with our department heads to identify potential savings. And at this point, you know, our goal is to maintain service levels, but should council provide different direction, then we would take that into account as well. But this is part of our annual process. It is a collaborative process between all of the department heads. And it's important that we have the context of this partial forecast as you consider the other agenda item today. But we still have a lot of work ahead and a lot of data yet to collect. So we appreciate your patience. And then on Tuesday, on the 16th, you will be receiving the operational efficiencies report. And so that provides another opportunity for conversation with all of you. So that's coming up on Tuesday. Thank you.
One more question before I turn it over to my colleagues, and it looked like we lost Mr. Hudis.
It does. I checked in attendees and I do not see him there, and he has definitely dropped off as a panelist.
So last question, maybe a little more difficult. So we've received some communication from the public that they believe if we don't get more revenues or reduce costs, we will just spend our general fund dollars on this. Is that what we would do? Are there other sources of money that we would spend instead? I know this year we did spend some money from our OPEB trust. So we effectively drained it a little bit. Is that a viable solution, though, to be draining our general fund? Is that what we would be doing if we don't solve this deficit?
So typically the general fund balance ebbs and flows depending on the nature of what's happening townwide. If in theory, and I say in theory because once again, this is a forecast. If this forecast were static and remained as is, then in theory, with deficits every year, we would continue to seek ways to balance the budget. But at some point, we would probably have to turn to reserves of that nature. That being said, we've had forecasts before that have shown deficits, and we have found ways to cure it. Once again, the item that will be heard next, depending on what the council does, and then depending on what the voters in November do, that alone could account for about 1.2 million. And similar to the comment you just made about OPEB, one of the reasons staff made that recommendation is because of the extent of the funding that has occurred since 2009. Even with that funding, we're still at an 81% funding level in our OPEB account, which is extremely good compared to other municipalities. And so that was one of the reasons where we thought it was okay to take advantage of some of the good financial stewardship the council and previous councils had done and use it. What it's intended for is to pay healthcare benefits. And so that money was being used to pay retiree healthcare benefits. It wasn't as if it was diverted for another purpose. So depending on what the deficits are, we will seek solutions in theory. And once again, I say theory because forecasts change all the time. I mean, the council members who have been here for several terms and even the new council members have seen how these can move, drastically, especially when we first went into COVID. We had literally just inked a financial forecast in February of 2019. Once we started seeing the ramifications of the complete lockdown in March of 2020, we did a series of forecasts just to show the ripple effects and what was happening. So staff will continue to monitor revenues, will continue to monitor expenditures. Management will work with the Finance Commission to follow the council direction, to look at packages of expenditures and to look at additional revenue potential options. But to your point, we've done a lot of incremental things already. And on the revenue side, we will probably start running out of options there at some point. But I believe we will be able to balance 23, 24. I believe the forecast will change. My guess would be probably for the better, and then we'll go from there.
If
And
I could just,
I
go
would
ahead.
just add that to a very direct point to your question, Mayor, we want to really protect the use of our economic stability reserves for the purposes for which they are intended, and our emergency reserves. So really, those are protected. It's not our intention to drain those reserves, but rather make sure that in our budgeting, we have adequate reserves every year because of the economic uncertainty. So our balanced budgeting strategies are not, it's not my preference to dip into those reserves at all. We need to find other mechanisms to use before we even touch those.
And to the town manager's point, even in the depths of COVID, at the Finance Commission, it was discussed and it was decided that things were not dire enough to even think of turning to those two sources of funding.
And one follow-up question, and then I'll get to my colleagues. So these forecasts deficits include two parts to the OPEB, the pay-go and then the actuarial determined contribution that would get us to 100% payoff. So we didn't just take from the fund, we also didn't add the contributions that would bring us to 100%. I assume this includes both that pay-go, meaning what's needed in this particular year, and then the contributions that are added to that to get us to 100% in our trust. Is that
That's
correct?
That's correct. And then I just want to go back to Mr. Hughes' previous question. So since we substituted some of the revenue, this is where that extra revenue comes in, the difference what you asked. So I'm sorry, I didn't have that answer ready, but we have to bring that revenue in to balance the budget.
And Mayor, back to your question. So during the OPEB presentation that the Oversight Committee will see at their next oversight meeting, the funding status is so good. And if, like with any actuarial evaluation, we continue to meet, the variables, including the assumed rate of return, the funding for the annual contribution is going to go almost to zero in the next 5 years, which once again was the reason why we were comfortable with the recommendation we made. And the recommendation will be to do what staff just recommended, not at the scale we recommended it for budget balancing, but the recommendation will be to start using the 115 trust to do the pay-go payments or a portion of the pay-go payments in the future.
Thank you. Let me go to Councilmember Sayak.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to just echo what Councilmember Hughes said, that we are it is a serious situation, and I think all of us understand the seriousness of this discussion. I do want to ask some questions about the desk item and see if it's possible for it to also include actions that the staff have brought forward, but were not acted upon affirmatively. Because what I'd like to do is to show all the different ideas that have been brought forward, and that we as a council and previous councils, a majority have decided not to take those into action at that time. But I think if this is so serious, we should always look at what options are available, and circumstances may change. And so I want to make sure that the next council has those opportunities to see what other options are available. Thanks.
Vice Mayor.
Thank you. I think, watching how the numbers were going, this is, kind of grim, but not a huge surprise. And we know that as a service organization, our costs are going up proportionally with the cost of living. I do want to thank, the staff and the previous councils for, in the past, identifying efficiencies, identifying sources of income. And I think, I like Councilmember Sayak's comment about looking at previous sources of income that perhaps were not adopted. And, can we take another look at that, or at least understand and examine it? I guess the other thing I'd like to see listed are some of the things that we're stuck with, like unfunded mandates. I know often there are state laws or, mandates that come down that we have to comply with that then increase our costs, and we don't have any wiggle room on that. So having a listing of that would be helpful to me, because, costs aren't just going up because of choices we're making. They're also going up because of situations that are imposed upon us. And the other thing is, I appreciate that we have the community survey that went out to find out from our community which services they value the most, where they think that we could improve, where they think we're doing well, and hopefully have that, I'm sure, be part of the conversation as we have to start looking at efficiencies. As staff identifies efficiencies, how and which services might be impacted, and where that falls on our community survey. Because I think as we move forward, if we are going to talk about beyond the next item, moving forward toward asking our community members to participate, our residents, we need to understand why they should care about it, what would be important about that, what we would be preserving, and what the cost of not moving forward would be. So thank you so much.
And Councilmember Hudis, I think you had more questions, comments?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think there is one other aspect that I think we need to keep in mind is that efficiencies doesn't just mean cutting services that residents might want, and expense reduction doesn't just mean isn't just the answer. There's another part of the equation, which are efficiencies that actually result in benefits for our residents, and that is efficiencies in cycle time, perhaps doing more self-service or using other tools to develop that. And that's why a few months ago I asked that we start targeting specific efficiencies that could be part of this equation. And I know it's scheduled for an upcoming council meeting, but often we leave that out. We talk about ways of raising revenue, which means tax increases mostly. And we talk about expense reduction, cost reduction, which people move toward, thinking about headcount or services that get cut. But there is another aspect that high-performing organizations constantly work on, and that is systematically trying to reduce cycle time and effort that it takes to deliver services that actually results in a customer benefit, customer being our residents, as well as resulting in some cost reduction. So having a systematic way of approaching that, I think, can also help us with that. The other point I just wanted to make in the earlier conversation about the savings and the salary savings, I think what we're really talking about, and correct me if I'm not correct, but is the difference between our forecasted or our budgeted headcount and our actual headcount due to vacancies. And that's, I think, the way that that turns out to look like a budget savings at the end of the year. But it mostly comes from the difference between budgeted headcount and actual headcount due to vacancies. Is that correct?
That is correct. And that is an item that the Finance Commission asked for. They'd like to see 5 years of what the adopted budget was, and then see what the actual was, especially as it relates to the salary and benefit portion.
Thanks.
Councilmember Badami.
Thank you. So back to the Vice Mayor's recommendation that we provide a list of unfunded mandates, which I think would be wise. But is it possible for staff to provide budgetary estimates on that, or is it just for informational purposes to keep it on a radar?
Well, you'll see in the efficiency report, I don't want to get into the substance of that, but that many of the efficiencies were out of necessity because we were given new unfunded mandates. So we had to somehow absorb all of that new work while maintaining all of the other things that we do. And so you'll see there are some very specific ones that you'll receive in your packet. It's difficult to estimate the costs. Some of them are very clear, such as RIPA, for law enforcement, where we've had to essentially create new databases and new hardware, et cetera. So some of them we can cost out. But I just want to also caution the amount of work that it takes to do costing when we also still have to provide services. So I think we can do our best to create a list of unfunded mandates and disclose those. It may not be comprehensive because, again, I also need to make sure that the staff are doing the service delivery part of our work, and putting cost estimates to all the unfunded mandates is going to be challenging, but we'll do that as best that we can as we look at those mandates. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pravetti.
And Councilmember Sack, you had more?
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I think there's an opportunity to look at these unfunded mandates without necessarily burdening your staff, Ms. Pravetti. That's what organizations like Cal Cities and Cities Association are for. And I'm sure if we're burdened by these unfunded mandates, we can certainly work within these regional organizations to see what other cities are experiencing. And frankly, this is where our legislative arm, and we've talked about this, do we develop a legislative policy where 5 council members should be advocating at a state level to fund these unfunded mandates and give real stories of how this severely hurts cities like ours. So I think there's opportunities there without necessarily adding more work. Highlight what they are, and then we could use, I'll bring them up at Cities Association, Cal Cities next month at the Long Beach conference. This is what these organizations are for and why we pay for that membership.
Okay, any other comments on this? Otherwise, I will close our item number 1 and we'll move on to item number 2, which was the main reason we were here, but I thought it was good for us to discuss the 5-year forecast a little bit also.
Thank you, Mayor and Town Council. So the item before you is a continuation from last Tuesday, where a motion was made that created a hybrid model of the ones that were presented. And due to the nature of the changes, the town attorney counseled that we should probably come back so you can see what the resolution and the ordinance and the ballot language looks like for that specific motion that was made. So the motion that was made was to increase the flat fees 30% and to add a annual cost of living factor to that schedule, to increase the retail and gross receipt schedule by 40%, and then to increase the manufacturing, wholesaling, and jobbing gross receipt schedule by 120%, pretty much in parallel with inflation since 1991. That schedule is also adding the term e-commerce, even though they've been paying under that schedule, the terminology wasn't in its title, and so we're adding that terminology. And so with that, staff is available for any questions.
Any questions before I go to public comment? Don't see any, so I will open public comment for members of the public to comment on item number 2. Don't see any hand raised. We did, talk pretty thoroughly on this last council meeting. So this is really just the small finishing work. So I'll come back, close public comment, come back to council and see if we have, I guess we probably want a motion for this. Councilmember Hudis.
I had a question and then I could make a motion. In the staff report under fiscal impact, it says the estimated additional revenue generated by the model is approximately 1.2 million annually. And so my question is the estimated annual 1.2 million a flat amount that goes on, or does that amount adjust in some ways to keep pace with inflation?
So that amount is just tailored to the motion and what the expectation would be in the first year based on current receipts and the models that we did develop. The flat rate piece will have an inflation adjustment factor if it's approved by council and then approved by the voters in November. And so 75% of our businesses pay under flat fees. And so a good portion of the fees will move with inflation. Theoretically, with gross receipts, if a firm is, their revenues are increasing, part of that could be attributed to increases in prices to keep up with inflation. And then therefore, as their gross receipts increase, they will be paying a higher percentage also. So there is the overt inflation factor that was in the motion, and then gross receipts to a certain extent will keep up with inflation to the extent that businesses pass on inflationary pressures through their revenues to their customers.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. If you wanted to go ahead with a motion.
Okay, I move to adopt the resolution whose terms were approved unanimously by the council on August 2nd in attachment 1 and call a municipal election on November 8th, 2022. The reasons I support the effort is that number one, it's necessary to partially close maybe about 1/3 of the structural deficit with a budget that supports excellent town services and modest capital improvements, which are required to maintain safety, comply with new state mandates, and provide the quality of life that our residents expect and deserve. Number two, it adjusts fees, many of which have been unchanged for 30 years. Number three, it has a mechanism to keep up with inflation. Number four, it provides for less regressive system whereby larger, more successful businesses who have thrived in Los Gatos and grown substantially pay a greater share than vulnerable smaller businesses. And finally, an extensive study and benchmarking has been done that illustrates regional fairness.
And Mr. Andrews, I think you probably think we're missing something in the motion.
The motion referenced attachment 1, which is public comment. I would just like the motion to reflect attachment 2 is the ordinance and the resolution. Thank you.
Sorry, I correct attachment 2.
That's what it does say in the recommendation. So there's an error in the recommendation. So Vice Mayor Risto.
Thank you. I'll second the motion, and I had a list of reasons to support it, but Councilmember Hudes actually covered all of them, so I won't repeat that. Thank you.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. Any further comment? Not seeing any, I'll call the question. Councilmember Hudes.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Risto.
Aye.
Councilmember Badami.
Aye.
Councilmember Sayak.
Aye.
And the mayor votes aye. The motion passes unanimously. Does staff need anything else from us?
We don't, Mayor and Council. Thank you.
And any last words from council members? If not, I'm not seeing any hands. I will adjourn this meeting and thank you all for the special meeting so that we could get this, make our deadline for tomorrow. So good night, everybody.